There is one nation positioning itself to profit from the global energy crisis regardless of which side wins, which alliances collapse, or which energy transition pathway the world ultimately follows. Not the United States. Not Saudi Arabia, not even China in the way most analysts assume. This nation has quietly structured its energy infrastructure, diplomatic relationships, and economic model to extract maximum value whether fossil fuels dominate for another 3 decades or renewable energy achieves rapid adoption within 10 years. And the most remarkable part is that this strategic positioning happened almost entirely beneath the attention of Western media and policy circles until it was already too late to counter. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what we are about to examine represents one of the most sophisticated geopolitical plays of the 21st century, and it is happening in plain sight while global attention remains fixated on US-China competition and the Ukraine war. I am going to show you exactly how Norway has engineered a position where it profits massively from both the prolonged fossil fuel economy and the accelerated renewable transition, why this dual positioning represents strategic genius that other nations attempted but failed to replicate. And in model exposes fundamental contradictions in how the West approaches energy security and climate policy. We will cover Norway's actual production numbers that few people understand, the sovereign wealth fund mechanisms that have accumulated over $1.6 trillion while other oil producers squandered their revenues, the renewable energy investments that position Norway to dominate European power markets regardless of fossil fuel prices, and the diplomatic maneuvering that allows Norway to sell natural gas to Europe while maintaining impeccable climate credentials. By the end, you will understand why Norway is not just surviving the energy transition. Norway designed its entire economic model to profit from the chaos and uncertainty that transition creates, and that model is working exactly as planned. Let me start with the numbers because understanding Norway's actual energy position requires cutting through the mythology that surrounds Scandinavian climate leadership. Norway is Europe's largest natural gas supplier and the 8th largest oil exporter globally. In 2025, Norway produced approximately 1.8 million barrels of oil per day and exported roughly 122 billion cubic meters of natural gas according to data from the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. To put that natural gas figure in context, Norway supplied approximately 30% of European Union natural gas consumption in 2025, making it the single largest supplier to the continent after Russia's exports collapsed following the Ukraine invasion. This is not a declining fossil fuel producer managing the end of an era. This is a nation at peak production capacity actively expanding output to capitalize on European energy desperation. Between 2022 and 2025, Norway increased natural gas production by 18% specifically to fill the gap left by Russian supply disruptions. Norwegian offshore platforms in the North Sea and Norwegian Sea operate at utilization rates exceeding 95%, and the Norwegian government has approved development of new fields expected to maintain production at current levels through at least 2035. Here is what makes this remarkable. Norway maintains this massive fossil fuel production while simultaneously positioning itself as a global leader in climate action and renewable energy development. Norway's electricity grid is 98% renewable, primarily hydroelectric power generated from the country's extensive fjord and mountain water systems. Norway leads the world in electric vehicle adoption, with EVs representing 87% of new car sales in 2025, according to the Norwegian Road Federation. Oslo hosts international climate conferences where Norwegian officials lecture other nations about the urgency of decarbonization. And Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the Government Pension Fund Global, has divested from coal companies and implemented strict environmental, social, and governance criteria for its investments. The contradiction is not accidental. The contradiction is the strategy. Norway has structured its economy to profit from fossil fuel production while building the infrastructure and financial reserves to dominate the post-carbon economy when that transition eventually occurs. And critically, Norway has positioned this duality as complementary rather than contradictory through messaging that emphasizes responsible production, environmental stewardship, and the necessity of reliable energy supplies during the transition period. Think about what that positioning accomplishes. European nations desperate for natural gas to replace Russian supplies cannot criticize Norway for expanding fossil fuel production because that production keeps European homes heated and European industries operating. Environmental advocates cannot effectively attack Norway because Norwegian domestic consumption is almost entirely renewable, and the sovereign wealth fund invests heavily in green technology. Developing nations cannot accuse Norway of climate hypocrisy because Oslo provides development assistance and renewable energy technology transfers. Norway has effectively insulated itself from the political and reputational costs that Saudi Arabia, Russia, or even American oil producers face when expanding fossil fuel production. Now, let's talk about the sovereign wealth fund because this represents the mechanism that transforms temporary fossil fuel revenues into permanent strategic advantage. The Government Pension Fund Global, established in 1990, now holds approximately $1.6 trillion in assets, making it the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. That represents roughly $290,000 for every Norwegian citizen in a country of 5.5 million people. The fund owns approximately 1.5% of all publicly traded stocks globally, according to Norges Bank Investment Management, which administers the fund. Here is the critical detail most analysis misses. Norway saves and invests virtually all of its petroleum revenues rather than spending them on current consumption. The Norwegian government operates under a fiscal rule that limits spending from the fund to approximately 3% of its total value annually, roughly equivalent to expected long-term real returns. Petroleum revenues flow into the fund, investment returns compound, and Norwegian government budgets depend primarily on non-petroleum tax revenues rather than oil and gas income. This structure means Norway is not dependent on sustained high fossil fuel prices to maintain government services or living standards. Compare this to Saudi Arabia, which despite massive oil revenues has struggled to build economic diversification and remains heavily dependent on petroleum income to fund government operations and maintain social stability. Compare it to Russia, which squandered energy revenues on military buildup and kleptocratic wealth extraction rather than building sustainable wealth for future generations. Compare it to Venezuela, which treated oil revenues as current income and built an entire economic model that collapsed when prices fell. Norway took the same resource advantage these nations possessed and structured it in ways that create permanent rather than temporary wealth. The investment strategy of the Sovereign Wealth Fund reveals the dual positioning in action. The fund holds significant stakes in renewable energy companies, battery manufacturers, solar panel producers, and wind turbine developers. Approximately 12% of the fund's equity portfolio is categorized as environmental investments according to the fund's 2025 annual report. Simultaneously, the fund maintains positions in major energy companies, infrastructure developers, and industrial firms that will remain relevant regardless of energy transition timelines. The fund has divested from coal and the most carbon-intensive oil producers, but it maintains exposure to natural gas, which Norway positions as a transition fuel, and to integrated energy companies investing in both traditional and renewable sources. This is not ethical investing. This is strategic hedging. If renewable energy achieves rapid cost reductions and deployment at scale, Norway profits through its renewable energy investments and its domestic hydroelectric infrastructure that can export clean power to European neighbors. If fossil fuels maintain market dominance longer than climate advocates expect, Norway profits through continued oil and gas production and through the fund's energy sector investments. If, as seems most likely, the transition unfolds unevenly, with some sectors and regions decarbonizing quickly while others remain dependent on fossil fuels for decades, Norway profits from both sides of that mixed economy. Step back and look at what this means for Norwegian strategic autonomy. Most European nations face agonizing trade-offs between energy security and climate commitments. Germany's decision to phase out nuclear power and depend on renewable energy left it vulnerable to Russian gas cutoffs and forced humiliating reversals, including reactivating coal plants and importing liquefied natural gas at premium prices. The United Kingdom's renewable energy investments have not eliminated dependence on natural gas for heating and power generation backup. France's nuclear-heavy grid provides low-carbon power but requires continued fossil fuel imports for transportation and industry. Norway faces no such trade-offs. Norwegian energy security is absolute because domestic renewable production meets all domestic electricity needs. Norwegian climate credentials remain intact because the country's per capita emissions are among the lowest in the developed world. And Norwegian fossil fuel production serves purely as export revenue that builds the sovereign wealth fund rather than supporting domestic consumption. Oslo can lecture other European capitals about climate ambition precisely because Norway's geography and early hydroelectric investments created energy independence that other nations cannot easily replicate. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Norway is not content to simply maintain current advantages. Oslo is actively positioning to dominate European energy markets in multiple scenarios through infrastructure investments that most analysis overlooks. Norway is building extensive offshore wind capacity in the North Sea, with projects expected to generate 30 gigawatts of capacity by 2040, according to the Norwegian Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. This offshore wind development will occur on the same offshore platforms and using the same maritime expertise that Norway developed through decades of oil and gas extraction. Simultaneously, Norway is investing in submarine electrical cables that will connect Norwegian renewable power generation to European markets. The North Sea Link, a 720-kilometer submarine cable connecting Norway to the United Kingdom, began operation in 2021 with capacity to transmit 1,400 megawatts of power. Additional interconnectors to Germany and the Netherlands are in development or planning stages. These cables allow Norway to export hydroelectric power when European renewable generation is insufficient and to import power when Norwegian reservoirs need refilling, creating a system where Norway functions as Europe's battery, storing energy as elevated water in hydroelectric reservoirs and dispatching it when market prices are favorable. Think about the economics of this arrangement. Norwegian hydroelectric facilities have already paid off their construction costs. The marginal cost of generating hydroelectric power is essentially zero beyond maintenance. When European power prices spike due to low wind or solar generation, Norway can generate and export power at nearly pure profit. When European renewable generation creates power surpluses and negative prices, Norway can reduce hydroelectric generation and preserve reservoir levels for future high-price periods. This arbitrage opportunity exists because of geographic advantages that other nations cannot replicate. Norway's offshore wind development creates additional dimensions to this strategy. Unlike Germany or the United Kingdom, where offshore wind capacity connects primarily to domestic grids, Norwegian offshore wind can supplement both Norwegian power exports and Norwegian oil and gas platform operations. Several Norwegian offshore wind projects are explicitly designed to provide power to oil and gas platforms, reducing the carbon intensity of fossil fuel extraction while maintaining production levels. This allows Norway to claim environmental progress in reducing production emissions while maintaining extraction volumes that generate revenue. Let me show you exactly how this plays out in current market conditions because the recent energy crisis demonstrates the model working in real time. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, European natural gas prices spiked to unprecedented levels as the continent scrambled to replace Russian pipeline supplies. The Dutch TTF natural gas benchmark, Europe's reference price, reached $345 per megawatt hour in August 2022, roughly 14 times its historical average. Norwegian natural gas exports to Europe occurred under long-term contracts and spot market sales that captured these elevated prices. According to analysis from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Norway's incremental natural gas export revenues from higher prices between 2022 and 2024 totaled approximately $185 billion beyond what revenues would have been at pre-crisis prices. That windfall flowed directly into the sovereign wealth fund, increasing its assets at a time when most European economies struggled with inflation, recession fears, and fiscal pressures from energy subsidies to consumers. Norway profited massively from European energy insecurity caused by geopolitical crisis while maintaining diplomatic relationships with the same European nations paying premium prices for Norwegian gas. The political genius of this arrangement deserves recognition. European leaders could not criticize Norway for high prices because market forces, not Norwegian price setting, determined natural gas costs. Environmental groups could not effectively attack Norway because European dependence on Norwegian gas represented the alternative to even more carbon-intensive coal power or continued dependence on Russian supplies. And Norwegian officials could frame increased production as a contribution to European security rather than profit-seeking behavior. Oslo transformed an energy crisis into a financial bonanza while enhancing rather than damaging its international reputation. But there is another dimension to this that reveals exactly why Norway's position is so difficult for other nations to replicate. So Norway's population is 5.5 million people. The sovereign wealth fund's 1.6 trillion in assets represents wealth accumulation that scales to Norway's population in ways that would be nearly impossible for larger nations. Saudi Arabia has roughly 6 times Norway's population. Russia has 26 times Norway's population. For these nations to build per capita sovereign wealth equivalent to Norway's fund would require wealth accumulation at scales that would dominate global financial markets and create unsustainable distortions. Norway's small population means the fund can invest globally without running into the problem of trying to find productive uses for truly massive capital flows. The fund's investment strategy spreads assets across thousands of companies in dozens of countries. Scaling that approach to a nation of 150 million or 300 million people while maintaining similar returns would be mathematically impossible. The strategy works for Norway precisely because Norway is small enough that global markets can absorb its investment flows without creating bubbles or running out of productive investment opportunities. Norway's geographic advantages compound this scale advantage. The fjord systems that provide hydroelectric potential are unique to Norway's specific topography. The North Sea oil and gas fields exist in Norwegian territorial waters because of geological formations that extend into Norwegian jurisdiction. The offshore wind potential exists because Norway controls extensive ocean areas with strong and consistent wind resources. Other nations can develop their own renewable resources, but they cannot replicate the specific combination of hydroelectric storage, offshore oil and gas, and offshore wind potential that Norway possesses in close proximity. Now, let's talk about the complications and limitations, because understanding where Norway's model breaks down is essential to assessing how replicable or sustainable this approach proves over time. First, Norway's fossil fuel production faces the same geological constraints that affect all petroleum production. Norwegian oil and gas fields are mature. Production from existing fields declines at approximately 3 to 5% annually, according to the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. Maintaining current production levels requires continuous development of new fields, and the most accessible resources have already been exploited. Future production will come from smaller fields, deeper waters, and more challenging geological formations that increase extraction costs. The economics of Norwegian oil and gas production depend on sustained, relatively high prices. At crude oil prices below $50 per barrel or natural gas prices below $6 per million BTU, some Norwegian production becomes economically marginal. The Norwegian continental shelf has higher extraction costs than Middle Eastern oil fields or American shale gas. If renewable energy achieves sufficient cost reductions and deployment to substantially reduce fossil fuel demand and prices over the next 2 decades, Norway's production could face economic pressure that forces reduction in output regardless of technical capacity to maintain extraction. Second, Norway's climate reputation depends on maintaining the fiction that producing fossil fuels for export is compatible with climate leadership as long as domestic consumption is clean. This position is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as climate science emphasizes absolute global emissions rather than territorial emissions. Criticism from climate advocates has intensified, arguing that Norway cannot claim climate leadership while actively expanding the fossil fuel production that drives global emissions. The Norwegian government has faced domestic political pressure from environmental parties and youth climate movements demanding an end to new oil and gas field development. So far, Norwegian political leadership has successfully maintained the consensus around continued production, but that consensus is not permanent. If Norwegian domestic politics shift toward genuine climate prioritization that includes production constraints, the economic model built on fossil fuel revenues would face fundamental challenge. The sovereign wealth fund's assets would remain, but the flow of new petroleum revenues would decline, potentially forcing changes in fiscal policy and government spending. Third, Norway's position as Europe's preferred natural gas supplier depends on European policy choices that could change. If Europe achieves more rapid renewable energy deployment than current projections suggest, demand for Norwegian gas could decline faster than Norwegian production naturally depletes. If Europe develops alternative supply relationships, such as increased LNG imports from the United States, Qatar, or potential future suppliers, Norway's market share could erode. If European carbon pricing mechanisms become strict enough to make natural gas economically uncompetitive with renewable alternatives, demand could collapse regardless of supply security considerations. Norway has limited control over these European policy trajectories. Oslo can lobby and influence, but ultimately decisions about European energy mix occur in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and other capitals where Norwegian preferences are one input among many. The geographic advantage of proximity and pipeline infrastructure provides some protection against displacement by distant LNG suppliers, but that advantage has limits if price differentials become sufficiently large. Fourth, the sovereign wealth fund faces investment challenges as it grows. With $1.6 trillion in assets, the fund cannot make investment decisions without considering market impact. Large positions in individual companies create governance responsibilities and political scrutiny. Divesting from entire sectors like coal or the most carbon-intensive oil producers has become politically necessary but reduces the investment universe and potentially constrains returns. The fund's size means it essentially owns a slice of the global economy, which means its returns track global economic growth with relatively limited ability to outperform through active management. As the fund grows larger, these constraints intensify. At $2 trillion or $3 trillion, the fund would face even more limited investment flexibility. The promise that the fund provides permanent wealth for Norwegian citizens depends on generating returns that outpace withdrawals, but achieving those returns becomes more difficult as the asset base grows. This is not an immediate crisis, but it represents a long-term limitation on the model's sustainability. There are also questions about intergenerational equity and the purpose of accumulating wealth that may never be fully utilized. Norway's fiscal rule limits annual spending to 3% of fund value, which means the fund grows faster than it is drawn down. This creates a situation where current generations of Norwegians maintain relatively modest public services and infrastructure investment while accumulating wealth for future generations who may face very different economic circumstances. Some Norwegian economists and political figures have argued for higher current spending on domestic priorities like healthcare, education, or infrastructure rather than continued accumulation in the fund. The counter-argument is that the fund provides insurance against future challenges and ensures that temporary petroleum revenues create permanent benefits. But the tension between current consumption and future savings will likely intensify as the fund grows and as fossil fuel production eventually declines. Norwegian politics will need to navigate these trade-offs, and there is no guarantee that future Norwegian governments will maintain the fiscal discipline that characterized past decades. Despite these complications, the fundamental assessment remains that Norway has positioned itself more successfully than any comparable nation to profit from the energy transition, regardless of how that transition unfolds. The Sovereign Wealth Fund provides financial resilience that most fossil fuel producers lack. The renewable energy infrastructure and investment position Norway to capture value from decarbonization. The continued fossil fuel production generates revenues during the transition period. And the small population means that accumulated wealth translates to meaningful per capita resources that can support high living standards even as the economic model evolves. Other nations have attempted similar strategies with far less success. The United Arab Emirates has built sovereign wealth and invested in renewable energy while maintaining oil production, but the scale of wealth per capita is lower and the dependence on petroleum revenues for government budgets remains higher. Canada has substantial fossil fuel production and renewable resources, but has failed to build comparable sovereign wealth or fiscal discipline. The United Kingdom had North Sea oil revenues comparable to Norway's in earlier decades, but spent rather than saved those revenues, missing the opportunity to build equivalent wealth. What Norway demonstrates is not just the importance of resource wealth, but the critical role of institutional quality, long-term strategic thinking, and political consensus in converting temporary resource advantages into permanent benefits. The oil and gas were geological gifts. The decision to save rather than spend the revenues was a political choice. The investments in renewable infrastructure represented strategic foresight. The fiscal rules and fund management reflected institutional competence. All of these elements together created the outcome, and missing any one element would have produced substantially different results. Looking forward, Norway's position will face tests as the energy transition accelerates and as geopolitical competition around energy and resources intensifies. European energy policy will determine demand for Norwegian fossil fuels. Global investment markets will determine sovereign wealth fund returns. Climate politics will shape whether Norway can maintain its dual position of fossil fuel producer and climate leader. Technological developments in energy storage, renewable generation, and grid integration will affect the value of Norway's hydroelectric resources and offshore wind potential. The most likely scenario is that Norway successfully manages a gradual transition from fossil fuel dependence to renewable energy dominance, while the Sovereign Wealth Fund provides financial cushion during that evolution. Oil and gas production will likely decline over the next 2 to 3 decades as fields deplete and European demand shifts, but the decline will be gradual enough that Norway can adapt fiscal policy and economic structure without crisis. Renewable energy exports and fund returns will increasingly replace petroleum revenues. And Norway's standard of living will remain among the world's highest because the accumulated wealth provides income streams independent of current production. The less likely but more challenging scenario would involve rapid collapse in fossil fuel demand and prices that makes Norwegian production economically unviable within a decade, while renewable energy costs fall so quickly that Norway's hydroelectric and offshore wind resources face intense competition from cheaper alternatives. In this scenario, Norway would face the challenge of managing economic transition without the gradual adjustment period the current plan assumes. The Sovereign Wealth Fund would still